morning, we are continuing to remember the victims of Flight 3407 who lost their lives 5 years ago today. Teresa Weekly is live this morning along Long Street in Clarence Center. Good morning.
Good morning, Jordan. The families of those victims of 3407 have really made it their mission in the last 5 years to make the skies safer for all of us and make a difference from this tragedy. News 4's Ed Dranch is out here with me this morning as well. And Ed, you've really followed these families' efforts. You've been with them to Washington, where they've gone some 60 times to push for change, and they have made a difference.
Yeah, these families are steadfast in their efforts to push for change. As you mentioned, they've been to D.C. dozens of times lobbying for that change because, as we've learned in the years since the crash, that crash was entirely preventable. Pictured with President Barack Obama, Beverly Eckert, a 9/11 widow, was a well-known advocate for strengthening security in a post-9/11 world. Days after this picture was taken, so too was Beverly in the crash of Flight 3407.
That was on February 6th, and on February 12th, she was killed. I think what was remarkable to us is that the President of the United States the next morning went on TV and said what a remarkable inspiration she was.
Inspired by her sister's courage, Karen Eckert has fought to change the aviation industry, lobbying Congress to make skies safer for the flying public.
It's channeling energy, it's channeling frustration. I mean, all those things that build up, we're stronger as a group. And so, it all comes together, and we make things happen.
Government reports blame the crash on pilot error. Investigations revealed a stunning lack of training among some regional airline pilots. Kathy Johnston lost her husband, Kevin, in the crash.
It didn't have to happen, and that's what makes you so angry. It was just a crash that was a crash. It wasn't an accident. It shouldn't have happened.
But positive changes have come about in the last year alone. Pilots will now spend more time training before taking control in the cockpit and will be highly qualified when they do. All a result of the crash of Flight 3407.
I love my 3407 family, so whenever I can get together with this group and we can do things together and have something positive come out of it, or planning a service, there's something in that for me too.
These families have indeed found solace in each other and solace in the fact that they are making the skies safer for the flying public. And all of those efforts have taken place, Teresa, over the last 5 years. Most of that change has taken place in the last year alone. But we have to remember that these people are people, and these victims are indeed people who lived among us. They were our neighbors, and we're standing on what's hallowed ground, what was once Doug and Karen Walensky's home. This is some place where these families have come and joined together to remember their loved ones. And each piece of this puzzle, each piece here, is symbolic to those victims and their efforts to lead the skies, to lead the way for change.
The charge for change, and not even just the families. I know first responders have come back here to remember that night, and so many people who knew somebody or had some connection to one of those people on that flight. We just heard Kathy Johnson talk about some of the positive that has come from all of their efforts, and we do want to talk about that now because there have been a lot of positive changes for all of us as we fly these commercial flights every day. We can tell you at this point that commercial airline pilots must now have a minimum of 1,000 co-pilot hours. They must have an enhanced airline transport pilot certificate with 50 hours of multi-engine aircraft experience. And by the way, they must also be at least 23 years old. As far as their testing now, commercial pilots must get at least 10 hours of rest between shifts. That includes 8 hours for uninterrupted sleep. And that means they have to have 30 consecutive hours of rest each week. Something that just happened that we told you about this past November, the FAA released new training guidelines. This is the first major update to pilot training rules in almost 20 years. So these new rules will force pilots to prove that they can prevent a stall in a cockpit simulator. A stall, as we now know, is what brought down Flight 3407. Now, as disaster coordinator for the town of Clarence, David Bissonnette became one of the faces of this tragedy. He was out here that night, and he was the calm leader of a dedicated army of first responders who raced into the eye of the fire in those frantic, chaotic first moments. However, it's his more than 2 decades of emergency management training that helped Bissonnette prepare for this tragedy of such magnitude. He had no choice but to shift into commander mode, he told us when we talked to him, quickly setting up a command center and also helping neighbors near the crash site to move to safety.
The visual impact of seeing a fully involved house and aircraft remnants. It's upsetting. Anytime there's a crisis, and particularly a crisis of that magnitude, there's a toll on the first responder, and those are the things we carry day after day. I can sit here and tell you 5 years later, the bond through first responders, fire service, law enforcement, EMS, has never been stronger, and it really makes us a resilient region.
Resilient indeed. Another thing that Dave Bissonette had said when we talked to him was that it was his 20 years of experience dealing with all the people who ended up responding to this that helped them really lead a coordinated effort. And he says now, after dealing with something of that magnitude, they are prepared for any disaster that will come their way. So coming up at 6:30, Jordan, you're going to hear from one of the first responders who was first on the scene that night.
All right, we look forward to that report, and we're going to be checking back with Teresa and Ed, as she said.